The Queen's Throne. A woman can survive being replaced. What she cannot survive is being underestimated. Tonight, in front of every crime lord in America, Dominic Vescari made that mistake. And before sunrise, he will understand exactly what he threw away. This is the story of Vivian Ashcroft, the woman who built an empire from the shadows while her husband wore the crown. If you've ever watched someone take credit for everything you've sacrificed, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Eat it. The invitation arrived on ivory cardstock with no return address, embossed with a single crest, a black eagle clutching a set of scales in one talon and a dagger in the other. Every man and woman who received one knew exactly what it meant. The Sovereign Summit happened once a year in a different city each time, at a venue that wasn't announced until 48 hours before the event. Security was absolute. Attendance was not optional. And whatever happened inside those walls stayed inside those walls, buried beneath layers of mutual destruction that kept every family's secret safely entombed. This year the venue was the Castellan Grand, a 100-year-old hotel in the financial district of New Orleans that had been quietly purchased 3 years prior by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The ballroom on the 14th floor could seat 400. Tonight, it held 312 of the most dangerous people in the country, dressed in suits that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, drinking champagne that arrived in crates from private vineyards, shaking hands that had signed death warrants and peace treaties in equal measure. Vivian Ashcroft arrived at 7:45 in a column of deep burgundy silk that moved like water when she walked. No jewelry except for one piece, the Vescari ring. It was old enough that the gold had softened from bright to warm, and the single black diamond at its center had been cut in a style that hadn't been fashionable since before the Second World War. It had belonged to Dominic's grandmother, and to her mother before that, and to the woman who had sewn it into the lining of a coat during a transatlantic crossing to keep it from being taken at the border. Vivian wore it on her right hand, always, not the left. She had never been sentimental about marriage. She was practical about symbols. Dominic was already inside when she arrived, stationed near the center bar with a glass of scotch that he held but rarely drank. He was 51 years old, still physically imposing in a way that had more to do with presence than size. Broad through the shoulders, dark-featured, with the kind of stillness that powerful men either cultivated or were simply born with. He had been born with it. That much was true. What had been cultivated, Vivian had helped build over the course of 22 years, though she had long since stopped expecting acknowledgement for that. He didn't look at her when she approached. He was already looking at someone else. She didn't break stride. Vivian moved through the room the way she always did, measured, unhurried, reading the architecture of social dynamics the way a field surgeon reads a wound. She could tell within 30 seconds of entering a room which alliances were straining, which old grievances had been freshly raked over, which men were performing confidence they didn't feel. It was a skill she had spent decades sharpening in rooms exactly like this one, and it never switched off. She spotted Aldo Ferrante near the eastern windows, flanked by 2 of his lieutenants, nursing a mineral water because Aldo hadn't touched alcohol in 11 years. She marked the slight tension in his jaw and filed it away. She caught the way Mireille Dubois from the Gulf Coast family was positioned slightly apart from the New York contingent, 3 feet of distance that would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention, but which told Vivian that whatever arrangement had been brokered between them in October had either fallen apart or was in serious danger of doing so. She made her way toward Aldo first, not because she had business with him tonight, but because the right greeting, offered at the right time, was worth more than any formal negotiation. She touched his arm briefly, said 2 sentences in a low voice that made his jaw unclench. He nodded. She moved on. This was what she did, had always done. The room didn't see it because it wasn't meant to. The dinner service began at 8:30. Vivian was seated at the head table, 4 chairs to Dominic's left, a positioning that would have read as meaningless to anyone who didn't know that the Vescari protocol placed the person with the most operational responsibility as far from the center as possible, so that if something went wrong, there was still someone standing who knew where everything was buried. Dominic sat dead center. Vivian sat where the work actually lived. She was halfway through a conversation with James Okafor from the Midwest Corridor about a supply chain restructuring that had been quietly eating into three families' margins when she noticed Selena Royce arrive. She had known about Selena for 8 months, not through surveillance, not through informants, though she had both available to her. She had simply noticed, the way she noticed everything, the faint smell of an unfamiliar perfume on a jacket collar, a text message read and locked too quickly, the particular way Dominic had stopped asking her opinion on anything in the spring. She had cataloged the evidence the same way she cataloged everything else, without emotional interference, without confrontation, storing it somewhere cold and dry where it would keep until she decided what to do with it. Selena Royce was 34 years old and genuinely beautiful in a way that was both natural and carefully maintained. She worked in private wealth management, which gave her legitimate access to a world she would otherwise have had no entry point into. She was not stupid. Vivian had assessed that early. She was ambitious, socially skilled, and fundamentally unaware of the depth of the water she was swimming in. That last part was the only thing Vivian had ever pitied her for. Selena moved to Dominic's side without hesitation, without the slight uncertainty that a woman in her position should have felt in a room like this. That told Vivian something she hadn't known before tonight. Whatever Dominic had promised her, it was specific enough and credible enough that she had stopped being afraid. That was new. That required attention. The dinner progressed through 4 courses. Vivian ate, made conversation, listened to 3 separate complaints about the East Coast tariff restructuring that she had personally designed and that was working exactly as intended, and watched Dominic and Selena from her peripheral vision with the dispassion of a woman reading a weather report. He was drinking more than he usually permitted himself in public. Selena's hand kept finding his forearm under the edge of the table. Vivian excused herself between the 3rd and 4th course, walked to the far end of the corridor near the service entrance, and made 2 phone calls. Both were answered on the 2nd ring. Both conversations lasted under 90 seconds. She returned to her seat before the dessert was placed. At 9:47, Dominic rose. The room quieted immediately. It always did when he stood. Whatever you wanted to say about Dominic Vescari's failures, and Vivian had a precise and comprehensive accounting of them, you could not deny that he commanded a room the moment he chose to inhabit it. He had a voice that carried without effort, a physical authority that most men spent their entire lives trying to approximate. He raised his glass, and the 312 most dangerous people in the country fell silent like a classroom. "Gentlemen," he said, and then paused and tipped his glass toward the 4 women at the table. "Ladies, you honor me with your presence. The Vescari Syndicate has called this summit for 23 years, and in that time we have built something that no single family, no single ambition, no single act of stupidity has been able to dismantle." He paused while scattered, controlled laughter moved through the room. "Tonight, I want to speak briefly about legacy, about what we leave behind, about what we choose to stand beside us when history decides how it will remember us." Vivian set down her fork. She had written versions of this speech for him in 4 different years. She knew his rhetorical patterns better than he did, and this wasn't one of them. "I have made mistakes," Dominic continued, his voice dropping half a register in a way that telegraphed intimacy, false vulnerability, the particular emotional register of a man performing honesty for an audience. "Mistakes that I allowed to go uncorrected for too long because I was too proud to name them. That changes tonight." He reached into his jacket pocket. Vivian's hand moved once, a barely perceptible tightening of her fingers around the edge of the tablecloth. He removed a small velvet pouch. He loosened the cord. He shook out into his palm the Vescari heirloom ring, not the one on Vivian's hand which she wore every night, which she could feel the weight of against her knuckle right now. A replica. He had commissioned a replica. She didn't know when, she didn't know how long he had been planning this, and that was the part that hit her like something structural giving way beneath her feet. Not the act itself, but the calculation behind it, the months of preparation, the deliberate, sustained deception of a man who had never once demonstrated the patience for anything that complex. She had underestimated something. The recognition of that landed hard and without mercy. For 22 years, Dominic said, his voice filling the room with the practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsing this moment, I gave my name and my loyalty to the wrong person. Tonight, I correct that. He turned from the head table, moved 3 steps toward where Selena was seated. She had been moved, Vivian realized, relocated at some point during the dinner to a chair with a clear sightline to where Dominic now stood, and took her hand. He lifted it. He placed the replica ring on her finger with the deliberate slowness of a man performing a ceremony. Selena Royce is the woman who stands beside me. She is the First Lady of the Viscari Syndicate from this night forward. The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a room absorbing a meaningful announcement. It was the precise, airless silence of 312 people simultaneously recalibrating what they were looking at and what it meant for them personally. Dominic kissed Selena's hand. Then he looked directly at Vivian. She looked back at him. She did not blink. She did not look away. She kept her face at rest and her spine straight and her breathing even, and she looked at him with an expression that she had spent years building. Not coldness, which was too legible, but a quality of absolute stillness, like something that has decided to wait. After 3 full seconds, he looked away first. Later, what the room remembered was the sound. Not Dominic's voice. Not the particular cruelty of a public ritual humiliation in front of every power center in the American underworld. What they remembered was the sound that came from the eastern wall of the ballroom at 9:53, which was not one sound but several sounds arriving in such rapid succession that the brain initially processed them as one. The double percussion of explosive charges detonating against the window frames, the cascading collapse of 200 pounds of tempered glass, the immediate scream of automatic weapon fire punching through drywall and marble and the crystal of chandeliers. Then every light in the room went out simultaneously. The darkness lasted exactly 4 seconds. Vivian knew this because she counted, not in her head but in her fingers, pressing each second against the underside of the table. She had already moved before the second, not toward an exit. Laterally along the base of the table, staying below the projected line of fire that the weapon noise was mapping for her. 2 shooters in the window breach. 1 suppressed weapon firing from somewhere inside the room, the particular acoustic signature bouncing off the ceiling told her roughly where. Someone grabbed her arm in the dark. She drove her elbow back hard, felt contact, heard a grunt, kept moving. The emergency lighting came on at the 4-second mark. Not the full ballroom lighting, but the low amber strips along the floor that turned the room into something cinematic and terrible. Bodies dropping to the ground, tables overturned. The sounds of 300 people discovering simultaneously that the performance they'd been watching had never been the real performance at all. Vivian straightened up behind the overturned serving station at the room's northern edge and looked across the ballroom. Dominic was gone. She knew where. There was only one place he would go. The escape tunnel access was behind the service panel on the south wall, disguised as a maintenance hatch, known to exactly 7 people in the world. 7, unless someone had told someone else. Unless one of those 7 had been less careful than they were supposed to be. She filed that away. What she did instead was this. She pressed 3 fingers against the back of her left wrist, where a thin vibration device was sewn into the silk lining of her sleeve. 3 pulses, a pause, then 2 more. The pattern she had established with her 6 auxiliary security coordinators 7 years ago, updated and re-drilled twice a year, never once activated in an actual emergency until now. The response came in under 90 seconds. From 4 different points around the ballroom's perimeter, figures in server uniforms straightened from their positions, reached beneath service carts and linen-covered stations, and removed weapons that had been placed there 48 hours before the summit with the quiet efficiency of people who had done exactly this kind of thing before. They moved outward toward the window breaches, coordinated and unhurried, the specific discipline of professionals who had trained for exactly this scenario. Vivian crossed the open floor to where Aldo Ferrante was crouched behind an overturned table, his mineral water somehow still in his hand, his expression furious and controlled in equal measure. She crouched beside him. "Shooters from the east windows," she said, keeping her voice flat and practical. One inside, northwest quadrant. My people are moving on all 3 positions. Stay down for 90 seconds. Aldo looked at her. Your people? Yes. You had security in the room. I have security everywhere I go. Beskari didn't sanction that. No, she said. He didn't. The firefight was controlled and decisive and over in 4 minutes. Her people were better than the attackers, not because they were inherently superior, but because they had been specifically prepared for a confined ballroom engagement in that specific room, having walked its dimensions and sightlines twice in the previous 2 weeks. The 3 shooters were neutralized, 2 dead, 1 wounded and detained, zip-tied to a chair near the service entrance before the main lights came back on. What Vivian did in those 4 minutes while her security team managed the tactical situation was move through the room. She stopped at 6 different points, spoke quietly to 6 different people, touched elbows and shoulders and forearms in the deliberate physical language of calm that human beings are neurologically wired to respond to. By the time the lights came back to full power, 312 people who had just experienced a violent attack in a locked room were frightened and shaken, but not panicking, not stampeding, not making the kinds of decisions that would have turned a controlled crisis into a bloodbath. That was not luck. That was execution. The room was still settling, voices rising from whispers to something more like normal human volume, when Vivian's lead coordinator, a compact woman named Daria, materialized at her elbow. South Tunnel was hit, Daria said, her voice low enough that it reached only Vivian. Charges set at the T-junction, detonated remotely about 4 minutes before the ballroom breach. Whoever planned this knew the tunnel configuration. Vivian held still. And Dominic? We have eyes on him 3 minutes ago, moving deeper into the maintenance level. He's not alone. A pause. Royce is with him. The attackers? Local crew hired through 2 intermediaries. We're pulling the chain. Daria's eyes moved briefly to the wounded man zip-tied across the room. He'll talk. They always do when they realize nobody's coming to help them. Vivian turned slowly and looked at the room. At the shattered chandeliers and the holes in the plaster and the overturned tables and the 300 people who were alive right now, frightened and furious and beginning to understand that something had just happened that was larger than a simple assassination attempt. She could see them processing it, could see the moment the questions started rising. Why was the escape tunnel compromised? Who knew about it? And if the tunnel was compromised, who compromised it? She had approximately 40 minutes before those questions reached the stage where they required answers. She needed Dominic back in this room before that happened, not because she wanted to protect him, but because the answers would land differently depending on whether he walked in under his own power or was carried. She looked at Daria. Go get him, Vivian said. Daria nodded once and moved toward the south wall. 2 of the security team fell in behind her without being told. Vivian turned back to the room, straightened her spine, and walked toward the center of the ballroom with the measured, unhurried step of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be. Aldo Ferrante was watching her. So was Mireille Dubois, who had stopped 3 feet short of the northern exit and was standing there with her reading glasses still in her hand and an expression on her face that Vivian recognized. It was the expression of a person revising a calculation they had been running for a long time. The wounded shooter was starting to say things now, low and rapid, to the security team member crouched in front of him. Whatever he was saying, it was making the team member's posture go very still. Vivian crossed the room toward them, her burgundy silk catching the amber of the emergency lights that nobody had thought to switch off. The Viscari ring solid and certain on her right hand as she moved through the wreckage of the most powerful gathering in the American underworld toward the man who, she suspected, was about to tell her something that would change the shape of everything she had already decided to do. She was almost there when Daria's voice came through the earpiece she had been wearing since 7:30, small and flat and careful. We found the tunnel. South Passage, 40 meters in. Vivian. A pause that lasted just long enough to carry weight. There's something here you need to see before Dominic does. Vivian stopped walking. The wounded man across the room lifted his head and looked directly at her through blood-streaked eyes with an expression that was not fear and not defiance. It was something closer to relief, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally found someone he trusted to put it down in front of. He opened his mouth. The truth that surfaced in those tunnels that night was not one truth. It was three, each one more damaging than the last, each one pointing back to the same source, each one arriving in the wrong order to give anyone time to prepare. And by the time Dominic Viscari finally understood what had been done to him, and who had helped do it, the woman he had dismissed in front of every crime lord in America was already 3 moves ahead of where he thought the game was being played. The man's name was Curtis Briggs, and he had been shot through the left shoulder sometime during the 4-minute firefight, which meant he had approximately another 20 minutes before blood loss made him unreliable as a source of anything useful. Vivian knew this the moment she crouched in front of him and saw the way the color was leaving his face. Not all at once, but in the specific gradual recession of a man whose body was quietly rerouting resources away from his extremities toward the core work of staying alive. She didn't waste time. "Who hired you?" she said. Not a question. A surface she was pressing on to see what came through. Curtis Briggs looked at her with those relief-washed eyes and made a sound that was half laugh, half the involuntary exhale of someone whose pain management was beginning to fail. "You already know." "I know some of it. I want to hear your version." "My version." He shifted his weight and his jaw tightened against whatever moved inside his shoulder when he did. "My version is I took a job that paid triple rate, which should have told me something. My version is the briefing said this was a message job, not a body count job. Hit the room, cause confusion, make the big man look bad in front of his people." He paused. "Nobody said anything about the tunnel." Vivian went still. "Say that again." "The tunnel charges. That wasn't our work. We were told the south exit would be clear for the primary target to use. That was part of the op design. We breach the room, he runs, he gets out, he looks like a coward in front of 300 people." Curtis Briggs blinked slowly, the way people did when their blood pressure was dropping. Somebody else put those charges in. Somebody who wanted him dead, not just embarrassed. Vivian stood up. Daria was already moving toward her from the south wall, reading her face the way she had learned to do over 9 years of working in close proximity to a woman who rarely showed anything on her face that she hadn't chosen to put there. When Vivian took 3 steps away from Curtis Briggs and turned her back to the room, Daria fell in beside her and dropped her voice to nothing. "Talk," Vivian said. "The charges in the tunnel were professional grade, not the same supplier as what was used on the windows. Different composition, different placement. Whoever set them knew the tunnel architecture in detail. They hit the one point where the passage narrows enough that the blast would be channeled forward. If Dominic had made it 40 meters in, he'd be in pieces right now." Daria paused. "He's currently at the 30-meter mark. He stopped because he heard the detonation from the ballroom breach and doubled back. He and Royce are behind a maintenance door. My team is outside it. He doesn't know about the charges ahead of him." "No." Vivian thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Don't tell him yet." Daria's expression didn't change. She had learned not to ask why in real time. She nodded and touched her earpiece and relayed the instruction in a murmur. Vivian turned back to the room. 300 people in various states of shock and fury, and the particular brittle alertness of powerful individuals who are not accustomed to being vulnerable. She could hear the conversations starting to crystallize, the whispers hardening into accusations, the questions sharpening into demands. Aldo Ferrante had pulled 2 of his lieutenants close and was speaking with the focused intensity of a man building a position before he had all the information, which was the most dangerous kind of position building because it calcified before the facts arrived. Mireille Dubois had her phone out, which meant she was either calling her security detail or she was calling someone outside this room, and Vivian needed to know which. She moved to Mireille first. "Put it away," Vivian said quietly, coming alongside her without breaking stride. Mireille turned, her reading glasses still in her hand, her expression sharp. She was 63 years old and had run the Gulf Coast operation since her husband's death 12 years ago, with a precision that most of the men in this room had spent the first 3 years actively trying to undermine and the following 9 years quietly respecting. She was not a woman who responded well to being told what to do. "Excuse me," Mireille said. Whoever you're calling outside this building, whatever you're about to tell them, wait 20 minutes, please." Vivian held her gaze. "What you think happened here and what actually happened here are two different things. If you move on incomplete information, you'll spend the next 6 months correcting it." Mireille looked at the phone in her hand, then at Vivian. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket. "You have 20 minutes, she said, as if she were granting a request rather than acceding to one, which Vivian permitted because the outcome was the same. She was crossing back toward the center of the room when the south wall access panel opened and Dominic walked back into the ballroom. He looked wrong. That was the first thing. Not frightened exactly, but displaced. The specific quality of a man whose internal map had stopped matching the territory around him and who hadn't yet figured out how to recalibrate. His jacket was gone. His shirt had a tear along the left sleeve where something had caught it in the tunnel. Selena Royce was behind him, one hand pressed against his back in the particular gesture of a woman who needs physical contact with something solid because everything else has become unreliable. The room saw him, and the temperature changed. It wasn't immediate. It was the slow atmospheric shift of 300 people simultaneously revising a perception. Dominic Vescari, who had walked out of this room 40 minutes ago, abandoning his own security detail, his guests, and every alliance obligation he had cultivated over 2 decades, who had grabbed a woman and run while his own people were still getting shot, was now standing in the doorway of a ballroom that his wife had just secured, looking like a man who had gotten lost in his own building. Aldo Ferrante stopped talking to his lieutenants. Mireille Dubois folded her hands. Dominic walked into the room and his eyes found Vivian, and she watched him make a calculation she recognized. He was deciding whether to lead with authority or explanation, and she could see the exact moment he chose authority, because it was the wrong choice, because it was always his wrong choice, and because the room was no longer the room he thought it was. "Where's my security team?" he said. His voice was steady. She'd give him that. "3 of them are in medical," Vivian said. 2 sustained minor injuries. 1 has a serious wound but is stable. The attackers have been neutralized. "Who authorized?" "I did." The 2 words landed with the specific weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud. The room heard them. Vivian had not lowered her voice. Dominic's jaw tightened. "We'll discuss this privately." "We'll discuss it now," Vivian said, "because in approximately 15 minutes, every person in this room is going to want answers, and you're going to want those answers to come from you, rather than from what the detained shooter is currently telling my people." Something moved in Dominic's face that she rarely saw there. Uncertainty. He covered it immediately, but she had seen it, and so had anyone watching closely enough. "Bring him to me," Dominic said. "No." The word hit the room like a dropped glass. Selena made a small sound behind Dominic, the involuntary vocalization of someone watching a situation go somewhere they hadn't anticipated and can't stop. Dominic didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Vivian with an expression that was working very hard at being dangerous. "You want to be careful," he said quietly. "I am careful," Vivian said. "I'm always careful. That's how this room is still standing." She turned away from him before he could respond, which was a deliberate choice, the specific physics of dominance, and moved toward the center of the room where the sightlines were best. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke in the tone she used when she needed to be heard without performing the need. "I want everyone to find a seat," she said. "The building is secure. We have a detained individual who is currently providing information. Before anyone leaves this room, I need 20 minutes to give you a complete picture of what occurred tonight and who was responsible." She paused. "After that, everyone here will make their own decisions, but make them with the right information." The room moved. That was the thing. It simply moved. The way crowds move when they encounter the specific frequency of genuine authority, which is different from performed authority in ways that are difficult to articulate but instantly recognizable. People found chairs. The tables were uprighted. Someone produced a tray of water glasses from the service station, and it was passed around with the automatic social courtesy of people whose manners were deep enough to survive a firefight. Dominic stood very still in the center of all of this and watched his room respond to his wife and didn't move. Selena touched his arm. He stepped away from it. The next 40 minutes were the kind that don't announce themselves as pivotal in real time. They arrived as ordinary minutes, some people sitting in damaged chairs in a damaged room, drinking water, and listening to information being presented with methodical precision by a woman in a burgundy dress who had not sat down once since the lights went out. Vivienne walked them through it without theater. The breach composition, the positions, the response timeline. The tunnel charges. Separate in origin, separate in intent, a fact that she laid down like a stone and waited for the room to pick up and examine. She presented Curtis Briggs's information in summary, corroborated by the physical evidence Daria's team had already compiled from the tunnel itself. She did not editorialize. She did not indicate what she thought it meant. She described what existed and let 300 intelligent, dangerous people draw the conclusions that the evidence demanded. The conclusion was not difficult to reach. Somebody had hired Curtis Briggs's crew to humiliate Dominic publicly. A separate party, connected to the first operation but not identical with it, had placed charges in the escape tunnel to kill him when he ran. The two operations had been designed to work in sequence, which meant whoever orchestrated the second one had known with enough confidence to count on that Dominic would abandon the room and run for the tunnel. They had built the assassination around his predicted cowardice as if it were a fixed variable. The room sat with that. Aldo Ferrante was the first one to say it out loud, in the flat, factual tone of a man who had survived 40 years in a business that did not reward sentimentality. Someone knew he'd run. Yes, Vivienne said. They planned around it. Yes. Which means they know him well enough to predict him under pressure. Aldo looked at Dominic. That's a short list. Dominic's voice came out harder than he probably intended. Watch what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Aldo said. I'm saying it plainly. Somebody who knows your habits and your exit routes and your instincts under fire built a trap around them. That means someone in your inner circle. He paused. Or someone who got that information from someone in your inner circle. The room was completely silent, and then Selena Royce made the mistake of speaking. It was not what she said exactly. It was the timing and the pitch and the specific defensive quality of someone who has just heard a conversation arrive at a place they had hoped it wouldn't. This is insane, she said. Her voice was too controlled, the control too visible, the way a person sounds when they are managing fear rather than actually unafraid. You're sitting here blaming each other when there are people out there. Nobody's blaming each other yet, Mireille Dubois said from across the room without looking up from her folded hands. We're identifying a source of intelligence compromise. She paused, and then she did look up, and she looked directly at Selena. How long have you been aware of the tunnel system? Selena's face did the thing faces do when a blow arrives that the body knew was coming but the mind wasn't ready for. What? I didn't even know there was a tunnel until 20 minutes ago. Dominic, Mireille said, how long has she had access to you in environments where operational security would have been discussed? The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. It had a specific texture, the texture of a room full of people holding their breath because they knew that the next word spoken would either ignite something or diffuse it, and none of them were certain which outcome they were hoping for. Dominic said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Selena turned to look at him with an expression that Vivienne recognized from the specific category of expressions that appear on people's faces when they discover they have been used. It was not anger yet. It was the precursor to anger, the pure clarifying shock of understanding in a single instant that the architecture of a situation they thought they understood was built on a foundation that had nothing to do with what they'd been told. Dominic, Selena said. He still didn't look at her. Vivienne watched this from across the room and felt something that was not satisfaction and not pity. Something more structural, the recognition of a pattern completing itself. She had built 7 years of contingency plans around Dominic's specific failures of judgment, and she had never wanted to use any of them. And here they were being used, not because she had forced the situation, but because the situation had forced itself, which was always the way it happened when you waited long enough. Daria appeared at her elbow again. Her voice was a breath. We have the chain. The crew that placed the tunnel charges traces to a contracting outfit that's been used by the Maranzano family out of Chicago 3 times in the last 4 years. Vivienne absorbed that. Confirmed? Financial records. We pulled them 20 minutes ago. A pause. There's more. The booking for Curtis Briggs's crew, the window breach team, runs through an intermediary that also has Maranzano fingerprints. Both operations, separate in execution, share a common source. One family, Vivian said. One family, Daria confirmed. And the intelligence about the tunnel configuration. We're still pulling that thread. But Vivian, Daria stopped, started again. The tunnel specs were in a document that only existed in one place digitally, Dominic's private server, encrypted, access restricted. She paused long enough that Vivian turned to look at her directly. Access logs showed the document was opened 16 times in the past year, 14 times from Dominic's device, twice from an unregistered device using a guest network credential registered to a visitor at his private residence. Vivian said nothing for a moment. The information was arriving in the wrong order, and she needed to sort it into sequence before she responded to any of it. When was the second access? 4 months ago. 4 months ago. Vivian ran the timeline. 4 months ago was when Dominic had begun bringing Selena to the house in Connecticut. She had known this because of the change in his schedule, the reshuffling of certain meetings, the particular pattern of a man reorganizing his geography around a new variable. She had noted it. She had filed it. She looked across the room at Selena Royce, who was standing 3 feet from Dominic, neither touching him nor moving away, frozen in the specific paralysis of someone who has not yet decided what the truth about their situation requires them to do. She looked at the woman's face. Selena Royce did not look like a spy. She looked like a woman who had fallen very hard and very quickly for someone whose world she was catastrophically unequipped to navigate, and who had made the particular kind of mistake that is not a moral failure so much as a failure of understanding the weight of the information that passes through a room when the wrong doors are left open. That distinction would matter later. Right now, it didn't change anything. Vivian made a decision. She moved back to the center of the room and spoke. The operation tonight was executed by the Maranzano family out of Chicago, both components, the ballroom breach and the tunnel charges. We have the financial documentation. We have the contracting chain. We have enough to present to every family represented in this room as a formal record. She paused. The intelligence that made it possible, specifically the knowledge of the Viscari private tunnel system, was accessed from a restricted document on Dominic's private server through a device used at his Connecticut residence 4 months ago. She let the room do the arithmetic. That access was likely inadvertent, which doesn't change what it made possible. The word inadvertent was precise and deliberate. She had chosen it because it was accurate, and because accuracy was the only currency that held value in a room like this, and because she was not interested in destroying Selena Royce. She was interested in the truth having the correct shape. Dominic stood up from the chair he had finally, in the last 20 minutes, allowed himself to sit in, and he did it with the controlled fury of a man who has run out of perimeter and knows it. You don't have the authority to present anything to this room, he said. His voice had gone very quiet, which was when he was most dangerous, or had been, in a different configuration of the world. You don't speak for the Viscari Syndicate. You don't speak for this alliance. You are my wife, and that is the limit of your standing in this room. Vivian looked at him. Check the Kellerman account, she said. He blinked. What? The Kellerman account. The one that's been routing the Gulf Corridor payments for the last 6 years. Check whose name is on the primary authorization. She held his gaze. Then check the Valdosta network. Then the Beaumont Intelligence Exchange. Then ask Aldo who he's been calling when the Midwest supply chain developed problems that you didn't know about. She could see it. The specific process of a man's certainties beginning to loosen from their moorings. Not collapsing. Not yet. But the first hairline fractures appearing in something he had believed was solid because he had never thought to test it. Aldo Ferrante stood up slowly. He was a deliberate man, and the deliberateness of the movement gave it a weight that the room absorbed. The Kellerman account, he said carefully, has been managed by Vivian for 11 years. I can confirm that because I am one of 3 co-signatories, and I have never once had a conversation about it with you. He was speaking to Dominic. I have, however, had 40 conversations about it with your wife. Dominic turned to look at Aldo with an expression that was trying very hard to be disbelief, and was failing because somewhere underneath it, in the place where he kept the things he hadn't examined in a long time, he already knew. Mireille Dubois spoke from across the room without standing up, in the measured tone of a woman who had been deciding something for the last hour and had now decided it. The Beaumont exchange was also Vivian's negotiation. I was present for 2 of those meetings. You were not invited because she told me you wouldn't understand the chemistry of what was being built. A pause. I agreed with her assessment. The room had gone so quiet that Vivian could hear the distant sound of sirens, still far away, the city outside beginning to register that something had happened in the Castellan Grand without yet knowing what. Dominic stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of chandeliers and the realization that was moving toward him like something inevitable, something with mass and momentum that could not be redirected by force of will or the particular authority of a man who had always mistaken the room's deference for his own power. Behind him, Selena Royce had gone completely still. She was not looking at Dominic, she was looking at Vivian, and on her face was an expression that Vivian had not anticipated, not hostility, not fear. Something closer to the look of a woman who has just understood, fully and without the mercy of gradual comprehension, the precise dimensions of what she had walked into and what it had already cost. Her eyes dropped to Vivian's right hand, to the ring. Then she looked away. Dominic turned to face Vivian, and what was in his eyes now was not fury and not calculation. It was the raw, unmanaged look of a man who has just discovered that the ground he's been standing on for 2 decades was not the ground he thought it was, and who doesn't yet have language for what that means, and who is about to make one more bad decision, because bad decisions under pressure were the one thing about him that had always been entirely his own. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Vivian agreed. "It isn't." She turned back to the room and was opening her mouth to speak when her earpiece clicked twice, the specific double click that Daria used only for information that could not wait, and then Daria's voice, tight and stripped of everything except the facts. "We just pulled the full financial chain on the Maranzano connection. Vivienne, the funding source for tonight's operation." A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "It's a holding company registered in Delaware 18 months ago. We have the beneficial owner." Vivienne's hand closed slowly around nothing. "It's not Maranzano," Daria said. "Maranzano was the contractor. The money came from someone else. Someone who used Maranzano as a cutout specifically so that the trail would stop there." Another pause. "The beneficial owner of the Delaware holding company is a woman named Elena Voss. She's a financial consultant who works for 3 clients." Daria's voice went very flat. "One of them is Dominic Viscari." The sirens outside were getting closer. Vivian stood in the center of the ruined ballroom and did not move for 3 full seconds, which was the longest she had stood completely still since the lights went out. And then she turned very slowly and looked at Dominic Viscari with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, because she had never before looked at someone and understood with complete and irrevocable certainty that the danger had never come from outside the room at all. The name Elena Voss meant nothing to the room. That was the point. That was the architecture of it. A name calibrated to produce exactly this. A blank, a gap, a woman-shaped absence in the center of a financial trail that was supposed to stop at Maranzano and go no further. It meant something to Vivian. She stood in the center of the ruined ballroom with 300 people at her back, and her earpiece still live, and the sirens outside drawing closer by the minute. And she ran the name against every file she kept in the part of her memory that she used the way other people use safes. Cold, dark, access restricted, opened only when necessary. Elena Voss, financial consultant. 3 clients, one of them Dominic. She had a face to put to it. That was the first thing. The face came before anything else. Early 40s, fine-featured, the kind of woman who dressed for invisibility in professional settings and achieved it completely. She had met Elena Voss exactly once, at a quarterly financial review 18 months ago, the same 18 months ago when the Delaware holding company had been registered. Dominic had introduced her as a portfolio restructuring specialist brought in to manage some offshore repositioning. Vivian had shaken her hand and exchanged 4 sentences with her, and then set her aside as an unremarkable variable in a room full of unremarkable variables. 18 months. She had been inside the operation for 18 months. Vivian's hand dropped to her side. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slowly, the specific respiration of someone who needs their heart rate to do something their body doesn't want it to do. The room was watching her. She was aware of that the way you're aware of light, ambient, unavoidable, requiring no particular attention. She turned to look at Dominic. He was watching her back, and something in his face had changed in the last 30 seconds. The particular quality of a man who has heard a name and is deciding, in real time, whether to show that the name means something to him or whether to perform ignorance, and who is not quite fast enough at the calculation to keep it off his face. He knew Elena Voss. Of course he did. She had been managing his portfolio. But the way his jaw had set when Daria's voice came through, that was not the jaw of a man hearing an unexpected complication. That was the jaw of a man hearing something arrive at a moment it was not supposed to. Vivian crossed the room toward him. She moved the way she always moved, measured, unhurried, no wasted energy, but the room parted for her the way rooms part for things that have acquired a certain kind of gravity, and by the time she reached him, she was aware that the ballroom had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not the silence of shock. The silence of an audience that understands the scene they are watching is the real one. She stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to be personal, far enough to be deliberate. "Elena Voss," she said, "I heard. Tell me who she is to you." Dominic's eyes moved once, a fractional shift to the left, the involuntary tell of a man accessing memory rather than construction, and then came back to her. "She's a financial consultant. She manages 3 accounts." "What accounts?" "Offshore repositioning, standard portfolio work." "Who introduced her to you?" Silence. "Dominic." Her voice had not risen. It didn't need to. "Who introduced her to you?" He looked at her for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, she watched something move behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, because Dominic had spent 51 years constructing a moral architecture that didn't have a room for guilt, but something adjacent to it, the specific discomfort of a man who is beginning to understand that the version of events he's been operating inside is not the version that exists in the world. "Selena recommended her," he said, 8 months ago. "Said she was the best in the business." The room heard that. There was no way it didn't. Vivian did not look at Selena. She kept her eyes on Dominic, and she counted to 3 inside her chest, 1 beat per count, because what she was feeling right now was not what this moment could afford her to feel, and she needed somewhere to put it before she could move. Not anger. Anger was too simple and too loud. What she felt was the specific cold clarity of a person who has just had the last assumption stripped away, the last charitable interpretation removed, and who is looking at a situation with nothing between herself and it at all. "She was already inside," Vivian said. Not to Dominic specifically, not to anyone. It was the sound of a conclusion arriving. When Selena came into your life, she didn't come into your life. She was placed there by someone who needed a specific kind of access. She paused. And Selena either knew what she was carrying or she didn't, but Elena Voss knew exactly what she was doing. Selena's voice came from behind Dominic, raw and stripped of the social polish she had maintained all evening. "I didn't know. I didn't know anything about any of this. Elena is someone I've worked with for 2 years. She's a colleague. Her voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, but the way voices break when they hit the hard edge of a fact they can't get past. "She asked me once about the house, the Connecticut house. I told her Dominic had it upgraded. I said he'd done renovation on the lower level." She stopped. "I was talking about the wine cellar." "The tunnel entrance is in the subfloor of the lower level," Daria said from across the room, in the flat tone of someone reporting a measurement. The sound Selena made was not a word. Vivian turned to look at her for the first time since the conversation had shifted in this direction. Selena Royce was standing with her hands at her sides, and her face doing something painful and private that it was clear she couldn't stop. The expression of a woman whose understanding of the last 8 months of her life was being restructured in real time by information she had no way to have prepared for. She was not performing. Vivian had spent 22 years in close proximity to people who performed emotions, and she knew the difference. Selena's distress was genuine. Her ignorance was real. That was not mercy. That was just a fact, and facts required accurate calibration regardless of their emotional weight. "Sit down," Vivian said to her, not unkindly. Selena sat. Vivian looked at Daria. "Pull everything on Elena Voss. Everything. Residences, travel, communications, financial relationships, prior clients. I want it in 20 minutes. "Working on it," Daria said, and moved. Aldo Ferrante had been standing through all of this with his mineral water and the specific patience of a man who processes information internally rather than externally. When the noise in the room had settled to a lower register, he spoke, and when Aldo spoke in that measured way, people stopped making other noise because they had learned to. "I want to understand something," he said. He was looking at Dominic. "Elena Voss has been managing accounts in your portfolio for 18 months. During that time, she has had access to financial records, correspondence, organizational structures." He paused. "What exactly was in the accounts she managed?" Dominic said nothing. "Dominic," Aldo said, with the patient inexorability of a man who has decades of experience waiting out silences. "What was in those accounts?" "Restructured offshore holdings." "Whose holdings?" Another silence. Longer this time. Vivian watched Dominic's shoulders and the quality of the tension in them, which was the kind of tension that came from a man carrying something that had gotten very heavy over a long period of time, and who was being asked to set it down in a room full of people who would see exactly what it was. "Joint holdings," Dominic said finally. "Alliance accounts, the ones that consolidated the Midwest and Gulf Corridor revenues in 2021. The room changed temperature again. Aldo set down his mineral water on the nearest surface with the deliberate precision of a man ensuring he had both hands free. "Those accounts," he said, "contain the financial infrastructure of every family in this room, routing information, beneficial ownership chains, the anonymous holding structures that keep 12 different organizations' assets untraceable." He stopped. "You gave a woman you'd known for 18 months, recommended by a woman you'd known for 8 months, access to the financial skeleton of the entire American alliance." "I didn't give her full access." "What access did you give her?" Dominic's silence was the answer. What happened next happened fast. Mireille Dubois stood up, which she did with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who has decided something and is implementing the decision rather than performing it. She buttoned the single button on her jacket. She looked around the room at the other family heads, with a glance that was not conspiratorial, but rather the look of people who have arrived at the same location by different routes and are now acknowledging each other's presence. "I need to make a call," she said, and this time she was not asking Vivian's permission. "Wait," Vivian said. "Vivian, wait." She said it again, without force, without raising her voice, but with the specific quality of someone who has information that the room does not yet have, and who needs 60 seconds to decide how to release it. She turned to the room and she spoke carefully, measuring each phrase before she placed it. "Elena Voss has already moved. Whatever access she had, whatever she was building toward, tonight was not the end of the operation. It was the beginning of a larger one. If you make calls right now, if you start moving assets and locking down accounts based on incomplete information about what she already has, you will tell her exactly which threads to pull. She will have time to collapse everything before we can identify where it went." The room sat with that. "So what do you propose?" Mireille said. The question was not hostile. It was the question of someone who has been in this business long enough to recognize when another person is 3 steps ahead and is asking to be brought current. "I propose we find her first," Vivian said. "And I propose that before we do anything else, every person in this room understands the full picture of tonight, including the part that nobody has said out loud yet." She looked at Dominic. He looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on him in 22 years. Not the controlled fury she knew, not the specific blankness he produced under pressure, but something older and more exposed. The look of a man who has run out of positions and is standing in open ground. "Say it," he said. quietly. Say what? Whatever you're about to say it. Vivian held his gaze for one long moment, and then she looked away from him and she looked at the room. For 22 years, she said, the infrastructure of this alliance has been built and maintained primarily through work I did without attribution. The Kellerman accounts, the Beaumont Exchange, the Valdosta Intelligence Network, the cross-family ceasefire protocols from 2019, the supply chain restructuring that added 40% capacity to the Midwest corridor in 2020. She paused. Dominic held the authority. I held the architecture. That arrangement functioned because it was never examined. She paused again. Elena Voss examined it. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of recalibration, the specific cognitive sound of a room full of intelligent people restructuring an understanding they had held for a long time. She figured out, Vivian continued, that the formal authority structure of this alliance was decorative, that the actual operational framework lived in a different place. And once she understood that, she began building toward a transfer, not of Dominic's authority, of mine. The accounts she accessed, the documentation she pulled, the organizational charts she reconstructed, they are a blueprint, not for destroying the alliance, for inheriting it. Aldo said, For who? I don't know yet, Vivian said, but I intend to find out in the next 2 hours. Daria appeared at the room's edge again, moving faster than her usual controlled pace, which told Vivian before she spoke that whatever she had found had altered the shape of the situation. She reached Vivian and leaned in. Elena Voss left the country 6 hours ago, Daria said. Private charter from a regional field outside Hartford. She was booked under a secondary identity, but the biometrics matched. She's in the air. A pause. There's a passenger manifest. She wasn't alone. Vivian went still. 3 additional passengers on the charter, Daria said. 2 we can't ID yet from the available records. The third one, she stopped. Started again in the careful way she started things when she was about to hand Vivian information that she knew would require very specific handling. The third one is registered under the name Marcus Ashcroft. The name arrived in Vivian's chest like something structural failing, not the dramatic cinematic collapse of composure, something quieter and more fundamental. The specific internal sensation of gravity shifting. Marcus Ashcroft was her brother. She had not spoken to him in 4 years. The separation had been mutual and necessary, and she had made peace with it in the particular way that people make peace with things they cannot change, not by forgetting, but by reclassifying, by moving what hurt to a place where it could be maintained without disrupting daily function. She had believed it was contained. She had believed the boundary she had drawn was solid. Marcus had known about the tunnel. He had been in the Connecticut house twice, in the years when they were still in contact, and he had been shown the lower level because she had trusted him with certain things, and she had drawn a very specific line around what she shared with him, and she had believed that line was real. She understood now that it was not. She understood, with the clean and terrible clarity of a person receiving information for which there is no preparation adequate to the reality, that her brother had not simply stumbled into Elena Voss's orbit. He had been there before her. That the pipeline of information from the Connecticut house to the tunnel blueprints, to the Maranzano contractors, to the charges in the passage where Dominic was supposed to die, it had not run through Selena Royce's innocent conversation about renovation work. It had run through her, through the part of her that she had believed was separate from all of this, through the one relationship she had maintained in the classified section of herself, away from the work, away from the architecture of what she had built, away from Dominic and the alliance and the 22 years of careful, invisible labor, through the thing she had trusted. Daria was watching her face. She had learned over 9 years to read what appeared there and what didn't, and what she was reading now was not the catastrophic disruption it actually was, because Vivian had in the space of approximately 5 seconds made the internal adjustment that she always made when reality required her to function at a level her emotions had not consented to. She picked it up. She put it somewhere cold and dry and sealed it. Later. Not now. Track the charter, she said. Her voice was level. Destination? ETA? any communication from the aircraft, and pull everything on Marcus's movements in the last 12 months. She paused. Everything. Daria nodded and stepped back, and Vivian turned to face the room again, and the room was watching her with the particular attention of people who had been present for enough to understand that something had just happened in the space of 30 seconds that had changed the landscape, but who didn't yet know exactly what. Dominic was looking at her differently than he had been 30 seconds ago. He had seen something cross her face, not what it meant, because he had never been good at reading the specific frequencies of what she actually felt, but the fact of it. The fact that she had been hit by something. "What?" he said. "It doesn't change the immediate priorities," she said. "What happened?" "The charter that Voss took out of Hartford," she said, and she made herself say the next part with the flatness that accuracy required. "My brother was on it." The room heard that. Dominic said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. She could see the words forming and being discarded, but because there was nothing that existed in his vocabulary for this particular configuration, nothing in the 22 years of their specific marriage that had prepared him for standing in a ruined ballroom at midnight, watching his wife receive information about a betrayal from inside the place she had thought was the most private part of herself. It was Aldo who spoke, and he did it with the careful neutrality of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. Marcus Ashcroft had knowledge of operational infrastructure. Some, Vivian said. A specific portion. The tunnel system was part of it. What else? This was the question she had been circling since the moment she heard the name. What else? What had she told her brother over 4 years of contact before the separation, in the specific relationship that had been the one place she had not been entirely strategic, had not been entirely guarded, had permitted herself the small operational luxury of being someone other than what this room required her to be? She ran it, methodically, the way she ran everything. The tunnel, the Connecticut property layout, 2 of the ceasefire protocol frameworks she had described in general terms during a dinner 3 years ago. The Kellerman account structure in outline once, in response to a question that had seemed, at the time, like simple curiosity. The outline was enough. The outline was a map. Enough, she said. Aldo nodded once and did not push. Mireia had been standing through all of this with the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to implement it. That moment arrived now. She looked at Vivian directly, and what was in her face was not pity and not judgment. It was the look of one woman to another that exists at a frequency below the social and the professional. The look that says, I see what this costs, and I'm not going to make it worse by saying so. What do you need? Mireia said. Vivienne breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the specific respiration of someone doing the fundamental biological maintenance that allows everything else to function. I need the room to hold position for 90 minutes while my team works the charter, tracking, and the Voss financial trail. I need no external calls until we know what she already has and what she's moving it toward. And I need... She stopped. Something was happening in her earpiece. A double click, followed by Daria's voice, arriving with the compressed urgency of information that will not wait. Vivian, the charter landed. It wasn't going out of the country. Daria's voice. It was domestic. It landed 40 minutes ago at a private field in New Jersey. A pause. And we have a signal off Marcus's phone. He turned it on for 45 seconds, enough to send one message. We have the recipient. Who? The pause that followed lasted long enough that Vivian's hand came up involuntarily and pressed once against her sternum, the gesture of a person managing a pressure that has no other outlet. The recipient is you, Daria said. He sent it to your personal number, not your operational line, your personal number. Another pause. The message is 4 words. Vivian's jaw tightened. Read it. Daria read it. The 4 words landed in Vivian's chest and did not pass through. They stayed there, in the place behind the sternum, where the things that cannot be reclassified immediately are held until there is time for them. And she stood very still in the center of the ruined ballroom while the room around her continued to breathe and move and wait. And she understood with a completeness that left no room for revision that she had been wrong about the most fundamental thing. The danger had not come from outside. It had not come from Selena Royce's innocent conversation about renovation work. It had not come from Dominic's carelessness with a financial consultant he should have vetted more carefully. It had come from the decision she had made 4 years ago to step back from her brother rather than look closely at who he had become. It had come from the mercy of distance, which she had mistaken for safety. It had come from the one place in her life where she had chosen to be something other than what this world had made her. And the 4 words he had sent her now, not an apology, not an explanation, just 4 words that told her something she needed to know immediately, meant that whatever Marcus Ashcroft had done, whatever he had given Elena Voss, and whoever stood behind her, he had done it knowing exactly what he was giving away. He had known it was her. The room was watching her. Dominic was watching her. Aldo and Mireille and 300 people in damaged formal wear were watching a woman stand completely still in the center of a ballroom that had been turned into a war room. And what they were watching was a person arriving at the full, unmitigated understanding of what had been done to her and by whom, and deciding, in the space of a single breath, what that required her to become. She turned to Daria, who had crossed the room toward her, and she said the name out loud for the first time since it had arrived in her chest. Marcus sent a warning, she said, which means he's not fully committed to what he's been part of. She paused. Or he wants me to think that. She looked at Daria with the eyes of a woman who has been patient and careful and invisible for 22 years and who has just run out of room for any of those things. Find him and find Elena Voss, and when you do, don't wait for my authorization. Move. Daria nodded and turned. And Vivian Ashcroft stood in the wreckage of everything she had spent 2 decades building and looked at Dominic Vescari, the man who had started this night by removing a ring from her finger in front of every power in the country. And she made a decision that was not about the marriage, had never been about the marriage, was about something older and more fundamental than any arrangement between 2 people. She was done being the architecture that held up someone else's ceiling. Whatever came next, she would not be building it for anyone but herself. She looked at the room. She looked at every face that was looking back at her. And then she said the thing that she had been refusing to say for 22 years because the time had never been right, because the cost had always been too high, because she had always found a reason to wait 1 more year, manage 1 more crisis, hold 1 more thing together from the shadows, where no one could see the hands doing the work. I need every family head in this room to remain present, she said, because before this night is over, we are going to restructure the authority of this alliance, and I am going to tell you exactly how it is going to work from here forward. She paused, and in the pause was the weight of everything she had not said for 2 decades. Not as a proposal, not as a recommendation. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. As a condition of there being an alliance left to inherit. The room did not erupt. That was the thing about rooms full of powerful people. They did not erupt. They compressed. The fury and the recalibration and the fundamental restructuring of 20 years of assumption pressed itself inward, into jaw muscles and folded hands and the specific stillness of people who had survived long enough in this business to know that the most dangerous response was always the one that looked the calmest. Dominic moved first, not toward Vivian. Laterally, 3 steps toward Aldo Ferrante, which was the tell of a man who still believed the situation could be recovered through alliance rather than confrontation, who still thought there was someone in this room who would stand beside him if he positioned himself correctly. Aldo, he said. 1 word, the compressed entirety of a request. Aldo looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his mineral water and took a sip and set it back down. No, he said. That single syllable did more damage than anything else that had happened in the last 3 hours. Vivian watched it land on Dominic's face and watched him absorb it and watched the thing inside him that had been holding shape begin, finally and irrevocably, to lose it. She didn't have time to watch the rest. Her earpiece clicked. Daria's voice stripped to its operational minimum. Charter passengers have a vehicle. Black SUV left the New Jersey field 22 minutes ago. We have the plate. It's moving south on 95, yeah. A pause. Marcus's phone came on again. 30 seconds this time. He sent a location ping. Vivian's jaw tightened. Why? That's not a question I can answer, but the location is a warehouse address in Newark. It matches a property we pulled from the Voss financial trail, registered to one of her holding companies, purchased 14 months ago. Another pause, this one heavier. Vivian, there's equipment registered to that address. Communications equipment. The kind you use to transmit large data packages. The entire financial blueprint of the American Alliance. Routing chains, beneficial ownership structures, account locations. The invisible skeleton of 12 criminal organizations' combined wealth. All of it in one transmission to whoever Elena Voss was moving it toward. How long before they reach the warehouse? Vivian said. At current speed, 25 minutes, maybe 30. How long to get a team there? 40, minimum. 15 minutes of gap. 15 minutes during which Elena Voss and whoever was in that SUV with her would have uncontested access to a communications array capable of transmitting everything that needed to not be transmitted. Vivian turned from the room and walked to the south wall and stood with her back to 300 people and pressed 2 fingers against her right temple and ran the arithmetic that she did not want to run. There was one variable that could close the 15-minute gap. One person who was already close enough to matter, who had sent a location ping, which meant he was still in communication range and still, for reasons she could not yet assess with confidence, making choices that suggested he had not fully committed to the side he appeared to be on. Her brother. She pulled out her personal phone. The message was still on the screen. 4 words in Marcus's unadorned typing style, no punctuation, the way he had texted since he was 19 years old. The 4 words were, "Don't come alone." Viv. She stared at them for 3 seconds. Then she dialed. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been holding the phone, which meant he had been waiting for her to call, which meant he had sent the ping as an invitation and not merely as information. She registered all of that in the half-second before he spoke. "You got my message," Marcus said. His voice was the same. That was the thing that hit her physically. The specific quality of her brother's voice, which she had not heard in 4 years, was exactly the same. And the body has its own memory that operates independently of every rational system. And what her body did when she heard it was a thing she noted and then set aside with the same deliberate force she had been applying to everything else tonight. "I got it," she said. "Talk fast." Voss has a buyer, not Maranzano. They were always just the contractor. The actual buyer is a consortium, 3 families, all foreign connected, been building toward a position in the American market for 6 years. They want the financial infrastructure because without it, they'd spend another decade trying to build their own entry points. He paused. The transmission is scheduled for 32 minutes from now. The equipment at the Newark warehouse is already set up. She has everything she needs. Where are you? 15 minutes from the warehouse. Are you with her? A pause that was slightly too long. I'm behind the vehicle. I'm not in it. Vivian processed that. When did you get out? An hour ago. When the charter landed, and I understood what the transmission meant. Another pause. And in this one was the specific weight of something that a person has been carrying for a long time and has decided, in the compressed timeline of a crisis, to put down. I didn't know about the tunnel charges, Viv. I knew about the financial play. I thought it was a hostile acquisition, money, structures, a power shift. I didn't know they were going to try to kill him. You gave them the tunnel layout. Silence. Marcus. I gave Voss information about the property. I didn't know what she'd use it for. His voice had gone flat in the way voices went flat when they were managing something they couldn't afford to feel right now. I know what I did. I know what it was worth to them. I'm not asking you to... He stopped. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you you have a 30-minute window, and I'm the only asset you have that's close enough to use. Vivian's hand pressed once against her sternum, the gesture she didn't make in front of people, the one that was hers alone. Then she dropped it to her side and straightened her spine. Can you get inside the warehouse before she starts the transmission? Yes. Can you delay it? I can destroy the primary transmission array. She'll have a backup unit, but it'll take 20 minutes to reconfigure. That gives your team time to reach the location. His voice was steady. The steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of it costing him anything. After that, you're going to have to handle Voss yourself. She has 2 people with her that I know of, possibly a third. And you. After I destroy the equipment, I'm done. I'm out. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not fighting your people, Viv. I know, she said. And she did know, which was the complicated thing, the thing she didn't have room for right now. Go. The moment you're inside, send me a signal. 1 ping. She ended the call before he could say anything else. She turned back to the room. Dominic was watching her from across the ballroom with an expression that had completed its transition from fury to something raw and more honest, which was the look of a man who has been comprehensively outmaneuvered and is trying to locate inside himself some response that isn't simply the acknowledgement of that fact. He hadn't found it yet. She didn't have time to wait for him. I need 4 of my people and 2 vehicles, she said to Daria. Now, and I need you to stay here. She held Daria's eyes for a moment. Whatever happens in the next 2 hours, this room needs to be managed. The families need to understand the situation completely before they leave. Can you do that? Daria's expression did not flicker. Yes. Vivian looked at Aldo. I'm going to Newark. When I get back, I'll have either contained the transmission or I'll have failed. If I've failed, every account in the Kellerman system needs to be locked within the hour. You have the authorization to do that. I know, Aldo said. I've had it for 3 years. She looked at Mireille. Don't let him make any calls. She meant Dominic. She didn't say his name. Mireille nodded once. Vivian walked toward the south wall without looking back at Dominic. She was aware of him behind her with the same peripheral attention she gave to everything in a room. Present, catalogued, not prioritized. The silk of her dress made no sound as she moved. The Vescari ring caught the edge of the emergency lights, still burning amber along the floor. And for 1 second, the black diamond at its center flared like something alive. And then she was through the door and into the stairwell and moving. The vehicle was a dark SUV that one of her security team had positioned in the loading bay of the Castellan Grand 2 days ago, because Vivian positioned vehicles the way other people position chess pieces, not for the move you were making, but for the move after it. She was in the back seat before the building's door had finished closing behind her. 2 of her people in front, 2 more in a second vehicle behind. She checked her watch. 26 minutes remaining. She checked her phone. No ping from Marcus yet. The city moved past the windows in the fractured light of a New Orleans night that had no idea what had happened 14 floors above it. The sirens she'd heard earlier had resolved into a perimeter of police activity 3 blocks from the Castellan Grand. Someone had called it in, a noise complaint or a reported disturbance, the kind of bureaucratic ripple that bought time without resolving anything. She had 40 minutes before law enforcement presence became a problem that required active management. 24 minutes remaining. Her phone pinged. 1 signal. Marcus was inside. She looked at the driver. How far? 38 minutes at current traffic. 14-minute gap. She calculated it cold without the interference of wanting a different answer. Marcus would destroy the primary array. 20-minute reconfiguration on the backup. Her team would arrive during that reconfiguration window. It was tight. It was the kind of tight that required everything to work the way it was supposed to work, which was a condition that tonight had already demonstrated was not guaranteed. She called Daria. Status? Dominic attempted to leave the room. Aldo physically blocked him. There was a conversation. Daria's voice carried the specific compression of someone describing an event they witnessed that they will reconstruct in detail later. He's sitting down. Selena Royce is still in the room. She's been on her phone to what we believe is a lawyer. Smart, Vivian said. There's something else. The wounded shooter, Curtis Briggs, gave us a name. Not Maranzano. A specific individual inside Maranzano who managed the contracting end. A man named Vincent Turo. Briggs says Turo had a contact inside the Vescari syndicate who confirmed the tunnel layout independently. A pause. Not through Voss. A separate pipeline. Vivian went still. Separate. Separate. Which means there were 2 independent sources for the tunnel information. Voss had it from your brother. Turo had it from someone else. Daria's voice was careful now, the way it got when she was handing over information she knew would require very specific handling. We ran Turo's contact history against the Viscari inner circle. There's one name that appears in his communication records twice in the last 6 months. Vivian already knew. The way you know things sometimes before they're said, not through intuition but through the accumulation of evidence that has been present all along and that the mind assembles ahead of the voice that speaks it. Whose name? She said, because she needed to hear it confirmed. Dominic's, Daria said. It's Dominic's number in Turo's records. The SUV moved through the city. Outside, the lights of New Orleans slid past in the amber and neon that had been present in that city for as long as anything had been present there, indifferent to the specific human machinery grinding itself apart inside this vehicle. Vivian held the phone against her ear and said nothing for 3 full seconds. He knew about the tunnel charges, she said. That's what the evidence suggests. He ran anyway. Yes. Which means he ran knowing the charges were there. Yes. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and looked out the window at the city and did the thing she had been doing all night, which was taking something that had arrived at a scale too large to process in real time and making it small enough to act on. Dominic had known. He had run into a tunnel he believed was rigged with charges. He had taken Selena with him, which meant he had been running not away from the tunnel, but toward it. Not fleeing the assassination, but enacting it. He had arranged to be seen running. He had made the sequence of events look like cowardice when it was something else entirely. When the charges failed to detonate, because the timing was off, because something in the remote detonation system had failed, because the 4-minute firefight in the ballroom had disrupted whatever signal was supposed to trigger them, he had doubled back. He had walked back into the ballroom looking like a man who had gotten lost. He had not gotten lost. He had survived something he had arranged to survive and walked back into the room as if none of it had gone the way he'd planned, and stood in the wreckage of his own failed operation while his wife dismantled it piece by piece in front of every family in the country. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had tried to use tonight to disappear had instead been made completely visible. "Does Aldo know?" she said. "Not yet." "Tell him," Vivian said. "Tell him everything. And Daria, make sure Dominic doesn't leave that room before I get back." She ended the call. 18 minutes remaining on the transmission window. They were crossing into New Jersey now, the bridge lights stringing themselves in reflection across the dark water below. Her team in the front seats had the focused silence of people who had trained for exactly this kind of approach, and who were running it internally. Timing, entry points, the specific physical geometry of moving fast through an unknown interior. Her phone showed the warehouse location on a map. 1-story industrial building in a district of 1-story industrial buildings. The specific urban camouflage of operations that needed to not be looked at directly. The satellite image showed 2 loading bays, 1 personnel entrance on the north face, no exterior lighting that was visible. She studied it. She looked at the approach vectors. She thought about Elena Voss inside that building, calm and professional, and moving through her checklist with the precise efficiency of someone who has been planning this for 18 months, who has not just survived tonight, but has been using it, the chaos, the distraction, the moment when every powerful person in the country was locked in a room managing a crisis, all of it providing perfect cover for the data transmission that was the actual operation. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which meant a number that Marcus had access to and had used rather than his own because he was aware that his own was being tracked. The text contained an address, not the warehouse address she already had, a different address 2 blocks east, and 1 line beneath it, "She's not at the warehouse." Vivian stared at the text for 1 second. Then she looked up. "Change of destination." She read the new address. The driver didn't ask questions. The vehicle turned. She was already running the logic. The warehouse was the registered address, the address that appeared in the financial trail, the address that her team had found through legitimate investigative work, which meant it was the address that Vivian's team would find, which meant it was not the address Elena Voss intended to use. The warehouse was a decoy, the kind of decoy that cost nothing to set up and worked perfectly on people who found it through the trail they were supposed to find. Elena Voss had known she was being tracked. She had known from the moment Vivian started pulling the financial chain that the trail would lead somewhere. She had made sure it led to the right somewhere. The warehouse, the registered property, the setup that bought her enough time at the actual location to complete the transmission before anyone arrived. Marcus had known about the secondary location, which meant he had been closer to the center of this than the version he'd given her on the phone, which meant she had to hold both things simultaneously. The fact that he had sent the warning, and the fact that he had withheld the secondary location until now, and the question of which of those facts was more revealing about where he actually stood. She filed it later. 12 minutes remaining. The secondary location was a converted commercial space above a freight logistics office, the kind of above that nobody looked at because the below was too boring to make the above worth investigating. The SUV stopped 2 blocks short, and Vivian was out of it while it was still settling, moving along the sidewalk with her 2 security personnel behind her at the specific pace that was fast, without being the kind of fast that registered to civilian observers as anything other than people in a hurry. She heard the second SUV stop behind the first. She stopped at the corner of the building and looked at the entrance. Second-floor windows showed light, one figure visible in silhouette, moving with the focused economy of someone at a workstation. The freight office below was dark and locked. She looked at the fire escape on the building's east face. Then she looked at her people. "North entrance," she said to the first team. "Wait for my signal." She looked at the second team. "East exterior. If anyone comes out a window, you catch them." She moved to the fire escape herself. The metal was the specific cold of industrial steel at midnight, and it bit through the thin fabric of her sleeves as she took the first rung. And the burgundy silk was wrong for this in every practical sense, but she was in it, and there was no version of tonight that had offered her time to change. She moved fast and quietly, which were not naturally compatible on a fire escape, but which she managed by keeping her weight on the outside edges of each rung and controlling her breathing to keep her shoulders level. She reached the landing outside the second-floor window. Through the glass, she could see the interior clearly enough. Elena Voss at a workstation, 2 screens, what looked like a transmission interface. One man at the door, her protection, standing with the particular posture of someone who had been standing in one place for a long time and had stopped being actively alert about it. A second man visible at the far end of the room, seated, looking at a phone. 3 people, as Marcus had said. She could not see Marcus. She did not have time to locate him before acting, which meant she had to proceed on the assumption that his position was somewhere she couldn't see and that it was his problem to manage. She looked at her watch. 9 minutes. She looked at the window latch. Old building, old hardware, the specific vintage of industrial fixtures that had been functional since before people worried about being accessed from fire escapes. She worked the latch with the blade of a card she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket. The movement practiced and quiet, and the window moved inward on a hinge that needed oil and provided half a second of sound that she moved through immediately, not giving the room time to process what it had heard. She was inside before the man at the door fully turned. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not elegant and was not the version of this moment that would have made sense in a cleaner story. The man at the door was fast, genuinely fast, and he covered the distance between them in less time than she would have estimated, and she took a hit across her left shoulder that drove her back into the wall and sent a spike of pain through the joint that she registered and set aside because there was nothing in the next 40 seconds that pain was relevant to. She drove her right elbow into the angle of his jaw on the return motion, felt the impact transmit up through her shoulder and into the damaged joint, and suppressed the response to it, and he went sideways and she was already moving toward the workstation. Elena Voss had not run. That was the thing. She had stood up from her chair, and she was standing in front of the workstation with an expression that was not fear and not defiance, but the specific composed fury of someone watching their precisely constructed plan sustain unexpected damage. And she had something in her right hand that she had retrieved from somewhere in the 2 seconds it had taken Vivian to cross the room. A drive. Small, external, the kind that plugged into any interface. "The transmission is already staged," Voss said. Her voice was professional, controlled. "It triggers automatically in 8 minutes whether I'm here or not. The only thing you can do is destroy this equipment, and destroying it doesn't destroy the staged files. They're on a server you don't have the location for." Vivian stopped 3 feet from her. Her shoulder was sending signals that she was declining to receive. She looked at the woman and she looked at the drive in her hand and she thought, with the cold precision of a person who has spent 22 years operating in the gap between what looks true and what is true, about what it meant that Voss was holding the drive up and explaining her position rather than simply deploying it. A person who has already won does not explain their position. "That's not a backup drive," Vivian said. "That's a kill switch." Voss's composure held, but something in her eyes recalibrated. The micro-adjustment of someone whose read of a situation has just been revised by the other person, demonstrating they understood more than expected. "The transmission can be stopped," Vivian said, "from this terminal, with a credential that only you have." She held Voss's eyes. "And you're going to give it to me." "I'm not going to give you anything. You're going to give it to me because the alternative is being in this room when my team comes through that door in approximately 45 seconds. And because whatever arrangement you made with the consortium that hired you comes with a specific clause about what happens to contractors who allow the operation to be compromised. I've seen that clause before. It is not in your interest for them to receive anything other than a success notification tonight." Voss said nothing, but the drive was no longer raised. "You walk out of here," Sir Vivian said. "The transmission doesn't go. The consortium gets nothing, but you're not in custody, which means you're not a liability to them yet, which means you have a window to make yourself very difficult to find." She paused. "That window is approximately 12 hours. I'd use it." Behind Voss, the second man had stood up from his seat, and his hand was moving towards something at his waistband, and Vivian said, "Don't," in the same flat, unhurried tone she used for everything, the tone that contained absolutely nothing performative. And the man stopped because tones like that have a specific register that the animal part of the human brain is calibrated to respect. From the other end of the room, from a space behind a secondary partition that she had not been able to see through the window, Marcus Ashcroft stepped into view. He looked like himself and also not like himself, the way people look after a long time and a version of events that changes something in the set of the face without changing the face itself. He was looking at Vivian with an expression that she was not going to parse right now, not in the next 8 minutes, possibly not for a very long time. He was holding a cable, physical, the kind that connected the workstation to its external transmission node. He had already pulled it from the wall. The screens on the workstation went to static. The automatic transmission timer, which had been counting down in the corner of the left screen, was gone. Elena Voss looked at the screens, then at Marcus, then at Vivian. The composed fury in her face did something complicated, the specific reorganization of a person who has just watched the centerpiece of 18 months of work dissolve in the space of 4 seconds, and who is intelligent enough to understand immediately and completely what it means. She looked at the drive in her hand, then she set it on the workstation. She picked up her jacket from the chair. She walked toward this window that Vivian had come through, and Vivian stepped to the side to let her pass, and Elena Voss climbed through the window and onto the fire escape and descended without running, the particular dignity of a person who has lost and has decided that how they lose is the only variable still available to them. Vivian listened to her footsteps on the metal until they reached the bottom. Then she looked at her watch. 6 minutes remaining on the original transmission window. The cable was out. The node was dead. The staged files were on a server she didn't have the location for, which was a problem for the next 6 hours, but not for the next 6 minutes. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her across the room over the silent workstation and the static screens and the wreckage of something that had taken 18 months to build and approximately 40 seconds to dismantle. Neither of them spoke. The door at the north end of the room opened, and her team came through it, moving fast and efficient, and she raised her left hand, the undamaged one, to signal stand down, and they stopped. She looked at her team leader. "Secure the room. Pull the drive from the workstation. Get the server location from the transmission logs before you shut down the equipment." She paused. Carefully. Her team moved. She walked toward her brother and she stopped when she was 5 feet from him, and she looked at his face and she found, inside herself, in the cold, dry space where she kept the things that needed keeping, the beginning of something that was not forgiveness. She was not at forgiveness, would not be at forgiveness for a long time, possibly never, but was the recognition of a person's complexity, the specific human condition of someone who had done wrong and had also, at the last possible moment, done this. She looked at the cable in his hand. You're going to have to answer for what you did, she said. I know, he said. Not to me. To every family in that room. A pause. I know. And you're going to give my team everything, every conversation, every piece of information you passed, every contact. Yes. She held his eyes for one more moment, and what she was looking for was the thing that would tell her whether the decision he had made tonight was permanent or situational, whether the man who had pulled the cable out of the wall was the real version or the performance. She didn't fully find it. She was not sure she would find it tonight, but she found enough. The specific exhaustion in his face of someone who is done with the thing they were doing. Not temporarily done, but structurally done. The way you're done with something when you've seen all the way to the bottom of it, and it turns out to be exactly as bad as the worst version of yourself feared. She turned from him and walked back to the workstation. Her shoulder was sending very urgent signals now, the adrenaline beginning to thin enough that the pain was finding its volume. She acknowledged it the same way she had acknowledged everything tonight. Noted, filed, deferred. Her phone rang. Daria. She answered. Dominic tried to access the Kellerman system remotely, Daria said. He used his primary credential. The access was denied because Aldo initiated a temporary freeze 20 minutes ago. A pause. He's aware that we know about the Turo connection. Mireille told him. I didn't instruct her to, but I also didn't stop her. How did he respond? He asked to speak to you. Another pause, this one with weight. He used the word negotiate. Vivian looked at the dark screen of the workstation and at the drive sitting on the surface next to it, and at the specific quality of the room's stillness after the event, the way rooms went still after something large had passed through them. Tell him, she said, that there's nothing left to negotiate. She ended the call. She looked at her team working the equipment and at Marcus standing at the room's edge with the cable still in his hand, and she looked at the window she had come through and at the fire escape beyond it and at the New Jersey night, and she made the calculation. Not of what came next, she knew what came next, had known since she stood in the ballroom and said the words she had been holding for 22 years, but of what it would cost. Everything, probably. Or close enough to everything that the difference was academic. She had paid similar prices before. She had simply paid them quietly, in the dark, without an audience. She found she was not afraid of paying them in the light. She picked up the drive from the workstation, closed her undamaged hand around it, and walked toward the door. The drive in Vivian's hand weighed nothing. That was the physical reality of it. A small piece of molded plastic and metal, lighter than a deck of cards, lighter than the ring on her finger, lighter than almost anything she could name. And inside it was the financial skeleton of every criminal organization in the country, the account chains and ownership structures and routing information the 12 families had trusted to exist in exactly one place. She put it in the interior pocket of her jacket, against her ribs, and walked down the stairs of the freight building into the New Jersey night. Her shoulder had graduated from urgent signals to something more insistent, a deep grinding ache at the joint that pulsed with each heartbeat, and that she was managing by keeping her left arm close to her body and her breathing deliberate. She had taken harder damage before. She had kept working through harder damage before. The body was a tool, and like all tools, it required maintenance that sometimes had to be deferred until the work was finished. The work was not finished. The 2 SUVs were on the street where she'd left them. She got into the first one and told the driver to go back to the Castellan Grand, and then she sat in the back seat in the dark, with the drive against her ribs and the ache in her shoulder and the specific silence of a person who has been operating at maximum capacity for 4.5 hours, and who is beginning, in the first quiet moment available, to feel the full weight of what that has cost. She did not permit herself to feel it for long. She called Daria. Status? Stable. Dominic has not attempted to leave again. The room is holding. A pause. 3 of the family heads have asked me directly whether you're coming back. I told them yes. Tell them 40 minutes. There's something else. Law enforcement. The perimeter outside expanded about 20 minutes ago. We have a contact inside the department who says a call came in about automatic weapon fire. They're building toward a formal entry request. Vivian looked out the window at the highway unreeling in front of them. How long before they move on it? Our contact says they're waiting on a supervisor's authorization. Maybe another hour, maybe less. I need this resolved before they come through the door, she said. Everything needs to be in place. The families need to have made their decisions, Dominic needs to be handled, and the room needs to look like 300 people attending a private event that sustained a security incident, not a criminal council in the middle of a succession crisis. Understood. One more thing. She pressed her thumb against the interior pocket, feeling the hard edge of the drive through the silk. The server location. Did the team pull it from the transmission logs? Yes. It's a facility in Montreal. We have the address and the access credentials from the workstation data. The files are staged there, but they were never transmitted. The connection was severed before the upload initiated. A pause. I've already sent a team. They'll be on site in 3 hours. I want that server physically destroyed, not wiped. Destroyed. Yes. And the consortium, Vivian said. The 3 families behind Voss. I want complete identification on all 3 before I walk back into that room. We have 2 of them confirmed. The 3rd is still being pulled. You'll have it before you arrive. She ended the call. She sat in the moving dark and she let herself think about Marcus for exactly the amount of time she could afford, which was not very long. He was in the building behind her with her team, giving them everything. She had seen the decision in his face, and it was real. She trusted her read of it, had trusted her read of people in situations like this for 22 years, and had been wrong only the specific number of times that any person who trusts their read is eventually wrong. Whether she had been wrong about Marcus, she would not know for a while. What she knew was that he had pulled the cable out of the wall, which was a thing that could not be undone, and which the consortium would understand as clearly as she did. He had made himself a liability to them. Whatever protection or arrangement he had operated under was gone. He would need handling. That was the word she used for it in her mind, because the other words, the brother words, the family words, the words that belonged to the part of her that she kept in the cold and the dry, were not available to her right now and might not be available to her for a very long time. She would handle Marcus the way she handled everything, carefully, completely, without sentiment and without cruelty, with the specific precision that the situation required. Later, the city reappeared around the vehicle as they crossed back into New Orleans, and the lights of the financial district resolved out of the dark ahead of them, and the Castellan Grand rose up with its 100-year-old facade looking exactly as it had looked 6 hours ago, before the night had taken the shape it had taken, before the chandeliers had come down, and the marble had taken holes, and the American underworld had been forced to look at itself from an angle it had never examined. The building's loading bay was where she'd left the security team. She walked through it and into the stairwell, and up 14 flights because the elevators were still offline from the security lockdown, and she did all of it with her left arm held close and her breathing managed, and her face arranged in the expression she had built over decades. Not cold, because cold was too legible, but still the quality of something that had decided. She pushed open the door to the 14th floor. The Castellan Grand's ballroom had been partially cleaned in her absence. Tables righted, glass swept to the walls, the larger debris of the window breach cleared from the main floor. The emergency lighting had been replaced by the ballroom's secondary system, warmer than the amber strips but softer than the full chandeliers, which were mostly gone. The effect was something between a crime scene and a boardroom, which was accurate. 312 people looked at her when she walked in. Or most of them. The ones who didn't were the ones who had been watching the door and had already made the adjustment. She walked to the center of the room and she stood where she had stood before, and she looked at the room and the room looked back. Dominic was seated at a table near the east wall between 2 of her security team who were not touching him and were not restraining him, and whose positioning communicated what restraint would have communicated without requiring it. He was still in his dinner clothes, jacket gone, shirt with the torn sleeve. He looked like himself, and also like a diminished version of himself, the way buildings looked after a structural event. The same footprint, the same address, but something fundamental altered about the load-bearing capacity. He looked at her when she entered, and she let him look, and she did not look back at him yet. She had something to do first. She reached into her jacket and removed the drive and held it up so the room could see it. The transmission was stopped, she said. The staged files were not uploaded. The server in Montreal is being addressed. She paused. Elena Voss has been given a 12-hour window to make herself difficult to locate. After that, she's everyone's problem equally, and I'll expect each family to contribute to that effort proportionally. She lowered the drive. I'll be distributing the consortium identification to every family head before you leave tonight. You'll know who they are and what they attempted to acquire. What you do with that information is your decision. My recommendation is a coordinated and simultaneous response, but I'll present the full case for that later. She set the drive on the nearest table. The immediate business, she said, is what happens inside this room. She looked at Dominic. He had been watching her through all of this with an expression that had settled in the time since she'd last seen him into something she didn't entirely recognize. Not the fury that was his default, not the calculated authority he used for rooms, but something quieter and more damaged, the specific expression of a man who has had 4 hours to sit with the understanding of what he did and what it cost, and who has not found, in those 4 hours, a way to make it smaller. She walked toward him. The room felt it. People shifted. Security positioned. The specific atmospheric pressure of a confrontation that everyone in the room had understood was coming and had been waiting for arranged itself like weather. She stopped 4 feet from him. "Stand up," she said. He stood, slowly. Not from weakness, Dominic Viscari had never been physically weak, but with the deliberateness of a man who is conserving something he knows he's running low on. They were the same height, roughly. She had always been close to his height, which had irritated him in the early years and which he had eventually stopped registering. Now it meant that when she looked at him directly. Not up, not down. The exact level of two people who are finally in the same conversation after a very long time of having different ones. Vincent Turo, she said. His jaw moved. Once. Vivian. Turo's contact records. Your number. Twice in 6 months. She kept her voice at the level of a private conversation. The room heard it anyway, because the room had gone that quiet. Tell me what that was. It's not what it looks like. Tell me what it looks like from where you're standing, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you arranged to have your exit route compromised and then ran into it. I didn't arrange anything. His voice had something in it she had almost never heard there. The raw, unmanaged register of someone who is not performing. Turo reached out. I returned 2 calls. I didn't give him anything. I didn't sanction anything. I told him the Viscari Syndicate had no interest in a Maranzano play against the Alliance. And the tunnel charges. I didn't know about the charges. He looked at her with the direct, undeflected look of a man who knows he has no credibility left and is speaking anyway because there is nothing left to lose by speaking. I know what the records look like. I know I can't prove a negative. I'm telling you, I didn't sanction the tunnel. I returned 2 calls to a man who was building towards something I told him I wouldn't participate in, and I did not follow up because I believed I had shut it down. Vivian held his gaze for a long time. She had been reading Dominic Viscari's face for 22 years. She had learned its architecture more thoroughly than she had learned almost any other things, okay? The tells, the calibrations, the specific quality of his deceptions, which were not small in number but which had a recognizable shape. She read his face now the way she read everything, without wanting a particular answer, because wanting a particular answer was the one corruption she could never afford. He was telling the truth about the tunnel charges. She could not prove it, and she would verify it independently before she acted on the assessment, but the read was there and it was real. He had not arranged to be killed. What he had done was return 2 calls to a man who was building toward an assassination, shut it down insufficiently, failed to report it to anyone, and said nothing when the attack actually occurred because saying something would have required him to explain the calls. That was not conspiracy. That was the specific, familiar 22-year pattern of a man who managed threats by closing the door on them and then not looking at the door again. The distinction mattered, not because it saved him, but because she was not going to tell a room full of crime bosses that her husband had ordered his own assassination on the basis of a read that she was the only person present equipped to make. She was not going to be wrong about a thing that large. "Sit down," she said. Something moved in his face that she couldn't fully name. He sat. She turned back to the room and she made herself take 1 breath, all the way in, all the way out, before she spoke. "I want to present a formal proposal to the families represented here," she said. "I'll be brief. You've all been awake since this morning, and the night has been what it's been, and I respect your time." She looked around the room, at Aldo with his mineral water and his patient eyes, at Mireille with her folded hands and the look she reserved for people who had earned her provisional respect, at the 24 other family heads and their lieutenants, and their various expressions of wariness and calculation, and in a few cases something that might have been relief. The Vescari Syndicate formally cedes the summit chairmanship. The organizational structure of the alliance will be rebuilt under a council model. No single family holds primary authority. Decisions require supermajority consensus. She paused. The financial infrastructure, the Kellerman accounts, the Valdosta network, all of it, transfers to council oversight immediately. I will remain as operational administrator for an 18-month transition period, after which the council elects its own administration. She paused again. This is not a power grab. If anyone in this room believes it is, I would ask them to consider what tonight would have looked like if I had wanted power rather than stability. The room was quiet. Aldo spoke first, the way he often did, in the measured tone of someone who had already reached his conclusion and was stating it rather than working toward it. The proposal is reasonable, he said. More than reasonable. He looked around the room with the authority of a man who had been present for every major event in the American underworld for 4 decades, and whose assessment carried the weight of all of them. I'll second it. Mireille was next. Agreed. She paused. With one addition. The administrative role that Vivienne is describing, operational administrator, I want it renamed and formalized. Not a temporary position, a permanent seat on the council, elected. She looked at Vivienne. You've been running this thing without a title for 22 years. That changes tonight. Vivienne said nothing for a moment. She had not expected that. She had planned for the council proposal to pass. She had built toward it carefully, the evidence of her work laid out across the room over the last 4 hours like a map of something that had always existed but never been named. She had not planned for someone to give the position a name before she asked for one. I'll accept that amendment, she said. The vote moved through the room in the specific way that votes moved in rooms like this. Not by show of hands, not by formal procedure, but by the succession of faces that resolved from deliberation to decision and the specific way people sat when they had made up their minds. It took 11 minutes. When it was done, there was no dissent. There were 2 abstentions, both from families with close historical ties to the Vescari Syndicate, and she noted them and would address them in the coming weeks. She looked at Dominic. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, not at the room, at some specific point between the window frames where the night outside was beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly at its lower edge, the first suggestion of a dawn that was still a couple of hours away. He looked like a man watching something arrive that he had known for a long time was coming and had been unable to stop. She walked to where he was sitting and she stood beside him and she said quietly enough that only he could hear it. The Vescari name stays. The family retains its seat on the council. Your personal accounts are untouched. She paused. You're not being destroyed. You're being repositioned. He looked up at her. Repositioned, he repeated with the flat quality of a word being tested for weight and finding it inadequate. Yes. And what is my position? You're a family head, 1 vote on a council, the same standing as Aldo and Mireille and everyone else in this room. She held his gaze. Which is, if you think about it, what you should have been from the beginning. 1 voice among several, not the only voice. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his hands, at the absence on his right hand where the Vescari ring had been for the last 19 years, and at the replica he had commissioned that was somewhere in this room, or in the tunnel, or in the wreckage of the night, and which she had not seen and did not need to see. I underestimated you, he said. You always did, she said. So did I, sometimes. About myself. She paused. That's done now. She turned away from him and walked toward Aldo. She had 3 more things to discuss with Aldo before the room cleared, and after that she had to deal with the law enforcement situation, and after that she had to reach the Montreal server team, and after that she had to sit down somewhere and have her shoulder looked at by someone who knew what they were doing. The list extended ahead of her into a day that had not technically started yet, full of work that was unglamorous and essential and invisible in exactly the ways that the work she did had always been. The difference was that now it had a name. Selena Royce was still in the room. Vivian found her as the crowd began its first tentative dispersal, seated at a table near the west wall with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, watching the room clear with the expression of someone who has survived something they didn't plan to survive and who hasn't yet developed language for what they survived or what it means about their next choices. Vivian stopped at her table. Selena looked up. She did not flinch, which was something, and she did not perform contrition, which was more. She simply looked at Vivian with the raw, unvarnished look of someone who has run out of social management for the night. "I didn't know," Selena said. "I know you didn't," Vivian said. "That's—" Selena stopped, started again. "That's not absolution. I know that." "No, it isn't." Vivian looked at her steadily. "What it is a fact. And facts have to be accurate before they can be useful." She paused. "Elena Voss used you. She identified you as someone with access to a person she needed access to. And she cultivated a professional relationship over 2 years with that specific purpose. And she placed you and she used what you inadvertently carried." She paused again. "That's not a thing you arranged. It's a thing that was done to you. There's a difference." Selena's jaw worked. "Doesn't feel like much of one." "It won't for a while," Vivian said. "Eventually it will." She started to move away, and then she stopped, because there was one more thing, and it was the kind of thing that she had been uncertain about for the last 2 hours. Uncertain whether to say it, uncertain whether it was her place to say it, uncertain whether saying it was an act of honesty or an act of something else. She decided, in the way she decided everything, by running the value of the information against the cost of its absence and choosing the one that was more accurate. "He was going to leave this life," she said. "Dominic. Whatever he told you, whatever version of the future he described, it wasn't possible, not because he didn't mean it when he said it, but because the thing he's built, the thing I helped him build, doesn't release people who were made by it." She looked at Selena carefully. "You got out before you were fully in. That's a rarer thing than you know." Selena looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude would have been the wrong register, but recognition. The specific look of a person receiving information that is painful and true, and that they will need a long time to fully integrate, but that they are glad, in some fundamental way, to have. She nodded once. Vivian moved on. The room cleared over the next 40 minutes in the organized, deliberate way that rooms like this cleared. Not in a rush, not chaotically, but in the particular purposeful dispersal of people who have somewhere specific to be, and who have learned, over years of doing this work, to move without looking like they're moving. Vehicles materialized in the loading bay. Arrangements were made. The Castellan Grand staff, who had been sequestered on a lower floor since the incident, were released in groups and would be managed through the existing protocols that the hotel's ownership, the Cayman Islands Shell Company, maintained for exactly these contingencies. By the time the first police supervisor arrived at the front entrance seeking authorization to enter, the ballroom held 43 people, all of whom were there as members of a private security consulting firm that had been engaged to conduct a threat assessment exercise at the venue. The physical evidence of the actual events had been addressed to the extent possible in the time available. The rest would be addressed in the days following through the channels that existed for exactly this kind of address. The law enforcement interaction lasted 40 minutes and resolved without entry. Vivienne was not present for it. She had delegated it to 2 people who were specifically equipped for that kind of management, and used the 40 minutes to sit in a room off the main corridor with a medic from her team who examined her shoulder and told her it was a deep muscle contusion with possible minor ligament involvement, and that she needed ice and rest, and that the ice was available and the rest was her problem. She took the ice. She sat in the chair with the ice pack against her shoulder and the drive in her jacket pocket and the Viscari ring on her right hand, and she let herself be still for the first time since 9:47 the previous evening, when Dominic had stood up with a glass of scotch and begun the sequence of events that had ended here. She thought about the ring. Not with sentiment. She was still not sentimental about it, but with the particular attention she gave to symbols that had outlasted their original meaning and acquired a new one. It had been a grandmother's ring, and then a symbol of marriage, and then a marker of belonging to something, and then an emblem of the work she did that no one named. Now it was the emblem of a thing that had been named. She turned it once on her finger, the slight friction of old gold against her skin, and then she left it where it was. Daria knocked on the door and entered. She looked at the ice pack and at Vivian's face, and she said, "The third consortium family has been identified. It's the Petrov organization out of Vancouver. They've been building toward an American position for 8 years." "Good," Vivian said. "Get me the full package before the council's first formal session." She paused. "When do you think we can schedule that?" 2 weeks, Daria said. "Neutral venue. I'll start the logistics." "Make it 3. Some of these families need time to explain to their people what changed tonight and why. If they feel rushed, they'll arrive defensive, and a defensive council is worse than no council." She adjusted the ice pack. "Also get me the Montreal team's ETA. 2 hours and 40 minutes to on-site. I want confirmation the moment the server is down." Daria nodded. She started to leave and then stopped. "Marcus is at the secondary location with 2 of our people. He's been talking since you left. He hasn't asked for a lawyer." She paused. "He asked if you were all right." Vivian looked at the ice pack on her shoulder. "Tell him I've had worse nights." Daria left. The corridor outside was quiet now, the particular quiet of a space that has been host to something enormous and is now resuming its ordinary dimensions. Vivian could hear, faintly, the sounds of the city outside beginning to shift from the register of deep night toward the register of very early morning. The delivery vehicles, the birds, the specific change in ambient frequency that cities underwent in the hour before dawn, when the people who stayed up late and the people who rose early briefly occupied the same streets. She had been awake for 21 hours. She thought about what came next, and the list was long and would stay long for months. The council structure, the Montreal server, the consortium response, the Marcus question, the law enforcement relationship, the alliance communication, the Dominic question, which was not resolved and would not be simple, and which she would approach with the same methodology she applied to everything, carefully, completely, without either sentiment or cruelty. She thought about the 22 years. Not with grief? She was not at grief, was not sure she would arrive at grief, which was a word that implied loss, and what she felt was not loss, but the specific, exhausted clarity of a person who has been carrying something at the wrong angle for a very long time and has finally set it down the right way. The weight hadn't changed. The carrying of it had. Something in the geometry of the thing had shifted, and the shift was not painless. Nothing that fundamental ever was, but it was real, and it was not going to reverse. She pulled the ice pack away from her shoulder and looked at it, and then set it aside. She stood up slowly, the specific negotiation with a body that has been asked to perform beyond its comfortable parameters, and that is now itemizing what that cost. She straightened her spine. She touched the ring once, a brief contact, thumb against gold, not a gesture of sentiment but of orientation, the equivalent of checking a compass bearing before moving. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair and walked to the door. The corridor was empty in both directions. The emergency lighting had been replaced by the hotel's ordinary corridor lights, which were warm and unhurried and indifferent to what had happened 14 floors above the city. At the far end of the corridor, through the fire door that opened onto the stairwell, she could see the faintest suggestion of light that was not artificial. The specific quality of dawn light beginning to arrive through a high window somewhere in the building's structure, gray and tentative and real. She walked toward it. The ballroom door was open at the end of the corridor. She stopped in its frame and looked at the room one final time. The space where it had all happened, the chandeliers gone, the marble patched with the pale evidence of the night's events, the tables righted and emptied, the room itself in the state of aftermath that would eventually be fully remediated by people who specialized in exactly that work. She thought about the ballroom before the night. 312 people. Champagne, the particular theater of power performing itself. A man rising with a glass and a speech she hadn't written, and a ring she hadn't known was a replica. The 4 seconds of darkness. The amber light of the emergency strips. The decision she had made in those 4 seconds, before the 3rd second had even finished, to not run. That had been the choice. Not the big dramatic one, not the speech, not the council vote. The choice she'd made in the dark when nobody could see it. To move laterally along the base of the table rather than toward the exit, To stay in the room and work the problem rather than leave the room and survive it from the outside. That was the choice that everything else had grown from. Every choice was that choice, really, whether to stay in the room. She turned from the door and walked toward the stairwell and the light that was beginning to arrive through the high window, and the corridor was empty around her, and the city was beginning to wake outside. And Vivian Ashcroft, administrator of the American Syndicate Alliance, keeper of the Viscari Ring, woman who had built an empire in the dark and had finally walked it into the light, moved through the building with the measured, unhurried step of someone who had somewhere specific to be. She did not look back. Not because the past wasn't real, or because the night hadn't cost what it had cost, or because the things she was walking toward were simple or clean or without their own weight. She didn't look back because she had learned over 22 years of staying in rooms that most people ran from that looking back while moving forward was the one inefficiency she could not afford. The stairwell door opened. The dawn light, gray and early and fully committed to arriving, came through the high window and touched the corridor and touched the ring on her hand as she moved through it. And then she was in the stairwell and moving down, and the door closed behind her, and the ballroom of the Castellan Grand was empty and still and full of the particular silence of a place where something had ended and something else, not yet named, had already begun.